Many have wondered if the details described in the Book of Abraham have support from ancient sources. Over the years, new archaeological and textual evidences have come to light that demonstrate the authenticity of the Book of Abraham as an ancient text.
There are numerous ancient documents that have come to light since the time of Joseph Smith, which substantiate and verify a lot of the information that we find in the Book of Abraham that is not found in the Bible.
The text is a more difficult target for the critics because there's some very interesting evidences that support the text. What could Joseph Smith have known about? What couldn't he have known about? There were writings floating around in the country that talked a little bit about Abraham or talked about some of the things that we find in the Book of Abraham, but what is the likelihood that Joseph Smith could have known these and collected all the right pieces from libraries or, archaic sources?
So generally, in the way the text is phrased, it has an ancient ring to it, and this is a comment, from a non-LDS Egyptologist. The English text of the Book of Abraham, which is written in a kind of a faux King James Jacobean language, which is common with Joseph Smith's scriptural productions. But if you took it out of that kind of language and you put it in normal, modern Egyptological type of vocabulary, that it would read very much, like an ancient document.
The similarities among all these early Jewish Christian texts and the Book of Abraham, one of the questions that often arises is, did Joseph Smith have access to these texts? Some apocryphal texts or pseudepigrapha texts, some others. Where then does Joseph Smith have access to all of these that even a learned scholar such as this critic didn't even have access to all of these texts?
Where a lot of parallels exist with the ancient world and with Abraham tales and traditions specifically. And so for me, the English text presides a wealth of parallels and evidence for the Book of Abraham.
And just, again, it's another, story of Abraham that we don't get in Genesis. And so it raises the question of where do these traditions come from? How do they suddenly appear, especially in multiple texts from, similar time period? The Apocalypse of Abraham is a really interesting text in comparison to the Book of Abraham because it seems to have a lot of elements that we see in the Book of Abraham, including kind of a two-part story where the first part talks about Abraham's relationship with his father, which wasn't the best because his father was an idolater and Abraham didn't feel that was right.
The Apocalypse of Abraham is an ancient pseudepigraphical work. That means it is basically an ancient document claiming to have scriptural authority written by an ancient biblical figure, but in fact probably was not. Nonetheless containing ancient traditions and historical material from that period.
But certainly the Apocalypse of Abraham that has the most, I think, connections with the Book of Abraham, he absolutely couldn't have seen, and even if he had seen a manuscript, all we have is Old Slavonic, and it just wasn't around and wasn't available.
In the Apocalypse of Abraham, Abraham is shown a vision of the world, of the universe, and it's described as being a vision of the universe in its circles, in two halves. If you look at facsimile number 1, you'll notice the upper half is upright, the lower half is upside down to it. That's the Egyptian way of rendering the idea that is really three-dimensional. The Egyptians had that concept. So it is describing the vision that Abraham had in a form that we have in the hypocephalus. So here we have even a text that is very similar to what we have in the book of Abraham.
It's kind of similar to the book of Abraham in that sense, where, his father's got these other religious beliefs and even tries to kill Abraham, and Abraham has to flee. And so in both accounts, as he's leaving, then he starts to gain a greater knowledge of God. And that knowledge in both texts seems to come from learning about the stars and the heavens and being given visions and so forth.
In another part of the Apocalypse of Abraham, it also talks about the elements of the earth obeying the commands of God in the creation process, which matches up nicely with Abraham chapter 4 and the description of the creation, where the gods watched the elements until they obeyed them.
He learns more about God, his plan, and in both texts it seems to talk about premortal life. God had already created things before earthly creation. It talks about Satan and his rebellion and being cast down to earth and gathering supporters for his cause.
Here again, we've got even actual wording that is similar to what we find in the book of Abraham, in a text that Joseph Smith could not possibly have known about, and if he had access to it, could not have read it because it was in a language he didn't know.
I think the strongest evidence for the book of Abraham is just the fact that it collects all of these strands of traditions of Abraham that we see appear in a variety of texts, Jewish, Christian, later Muslim texts, that go beyond the story of Genesis. And how could all of these early texts share the same kind of stories that the book of Abraham also shares, and yet they weren't all around during the time of Joseph Smith?